Agile is all about welcoming change for the benefit of a customer, but still, one type of change tends to be very frustrating for the teams, the Scrum teams, the Agile teams. Mid-sprint, unplanned work just pop up out of nowhere. You know the feeling. You've been crushing it in terms of completing stories during the sprint. Then, at some point in time, a manager, upper management executive comes in and asks you to do an urgent stuff, an urgent work, or a customer. A new requirement just falls from a customer, urgent requirement. Or the product owner just realized that we missed a regulatory request when doing the planning for the sprint. What do you do in all these situations? Well, in this video, I'm going to cover all possible scenarios, giving you real-life solutions that you can start using with your teams right now as a product owner, as a Scrum Master, or even a developer. Let's start with the basics. As per the Scrum Guide 2020, no changes are made during the sprint that would endanger the sprint goal. Quite simple. Now, for those who don't know, the sprint goal, pretty simple. It's a single objective for the sprint of a team. It improves focus. Everyone is focusing on a single goal instead of having everyone focus on different things during the sprint. It improves focus, it improves collaboration, and you're working as a team, empowered as a team on a single target, on a single goal. The Scrum Guide is very clear. Changes can be made in the sprint, adding tasks, removing stories, changing any type of work, but without endangering the sprint goal. If a product owner insists on changing something in the sprint that will endanger the sprint goal, will make the sprint goal no longer relevant, the Scrum Guide recommends terminating the sprint and starting a new one. Let's go through an example here, but first, an assumption. Let's assume that something happens to the team mid-sprint, a new requirement, a change in requirement, a regulatory request, new requirement from customer, anything, but it happens mid-sprint. Planning has already been done 1 week into the sprint, and it doesn't endanger the sprint goal. Something happened midweek, doesn't endanger the sprint goal, and it needs to be done this sprint. The first thing that the team needs to do is to ensure that the product owner is aware of this requirement, this change in requirement, this new work. Sometimes stakeholders, managers talk directly to developers. Shouldn't be the case. Everything should go through the product owner. The product owner is the owner of a backlog. The product owner gets the final say on whether this change will be included in this current sprint. And to do this, the product owner needs to evaluate if it makes sense to add this change in the current sprint. You can ask 2 questions here, but first, remember, not because something was mentioned by a manager, a customer, or anyone, it means that it needs to be added in the current sprint. So based on this premise, 2 questions. First, is it urgent? Urgent enough to be done right now, or can it wait a few more days for the next sprint planning? Second question, is it valuable enough? In some cases, we'll talk about later, but in some cases, you might need to remove something else from a sprint backlog to add this new change. Is this new change more valuable than other things in the sprint backlog? More valuable than other things that we already planned and we said we would do? Is it more valuable? Is it valuable enough to justify this big change mid-sprint? You need to answer these questions honestly. And if this change is urgent enough and valuable enough, then it makes sense to add this change to the current sprint. Now, let's go through some strategies, 4 strategies that your team can use to handle this unplanned work. The first strategy, improving prioritization. A couple of days after the sprint has begun, the product owner in the daily scrum tells the team that there's something urgent to do. A new change that needs to be added to the sprint. A new change brought up by a stakeholder somewhere in the organization. And the team decides to do it. Then a few days later, same thing. Now someone, upper management, wants something pretty urgent, needs to be included in the sprint. And the team agrees to do it. And at the end of the sprint, the velocity of the team, what they agreed on, what they committed on, they couldn't do. They couldn't do because there were so many changes in the sprint. What do you do in this situation? The first thing you need to do as a Scrum Master is talk to the product owner. Teach the product owner how to say no. teach the product owner that Agile welcomes change, but change mid-sprint, unplanned work, especially big piece of work mid-sprint, urgent. It's hard to manage this type of work without impacting the team or impacting the goal of a sprint that was already committed on. The product owner needs to understand this, how to say no and how a sprint and a sprint planning works. The product owner can then use this information to persuade, convince, manage stakeholders. The second strategy is absorption. Maybe mid-sprint, the development team shows completed work to the product owner, and then the product owner realizes that there's a missing requirement, a crucial requirement missing, but small requirement. Or maybe there's a bug just cropped up mid-sprint, small bug. What do you do in these two situations? Well, quite simple. It's a small thing. It can be absorbed by the team if the team agrees on absorbing it. Obviously, it needs to be urgent. Obviously, it needs to be valuable. But it's still a small piece of work, so the team can easily absorb it. Only if they can handle this piece of work without impacting the sprint goal. Now, let's say it's a big piece of work. Bigger piece of work. Maybe this big piece of work can be split into smaller tasks, smaller user stories, and you can take a small piece, a small task, a small user stories this sprint, and then you can plan the rest later. You can take the most urgent part or most valuable part this sprint, and then you can do the rest later. Another good strategy is to replace same scenario, a bug just cropped up mid-sprint. Now, this time, this bug quite complex, quite big. What do? Well, this thing is urgent. This thing is still valuable, so we need to do it this sprint, and it doesn't endanger the sprint goal. It needs to be done. A good strategy is to replace something in the backlog, in the sprint backlog, with this bug. This thing to replace should be the same size as this bug, this new item, this change. How do you know the size? You don't ask the product owner, you don't ask the scrum master or stakeholders, you ask the development team. They do the estimation, they do the work, you ask the development team. The development team will decide on the size, and once we have some potential solutions, some potential piece of work, user stories, task that can be removed and replaced by this bug, same size, the product owner can then decide. Another good strategy is to use a buffer. As an example, a team has owned the backend work for a particular system for a very long time. And once a sprint starts for this team, they get bombarded by all teams asking for help. You have multiple ways of handling this solution, and adding a buffer can be one of them. There's two ways to add a buffer. First, you can plan a virtual backlog item that will act as a buffer for all the backend work. The sizing of a backlog item, this virtual backlog item, really depends on how you estimate work. Let's say you're using story points. You can estimate it to maybe 10 story points. You get 10 based on past data. You can use past data to predict how much backend work you'll get in the future. Let's say it's 10 story points. And each time a backend work comes mid-sprint, you use the 10 story point and you subtract the complexity or the estimation of this new item from this 10 story point until this 10 story point becomes 0, until the virtual backlog item becomes 0. Then you can reject all the new incoming backend work mid-sprint. The second way to handle this situation is to take less in terms of velocity. Let's say the team has a velocity of 100 points. They estimate in story points 100 points. And the team knows that each sprint, mid-sprint, there's tons of backend work, unplanned work, around 15 points of unplanned work every sprint. So in the next sprint, instead of taking 100 points, the team will take only 85 points. 100 subtract 15, because 15 is the amount of backend work that you're guessing will come. So instead of taking 100 points of stories, task, plan the thing, you only take 85. And the rest will simply be a buffer for this backend type of work. Which brings me to my next point. If you want more tips, insights on Agile, Scrum, personal growth, click on the video that stands out the most on the screen right now, and I'll see you in a few seconds.